I know, it's been nearly half a year since boss rankings 1. Time sure flies, huh? Well, we're here to finish this. We being me and this guy.
As you probably know, I'm Nex. I make guide videos on YouTube, and you should subscribe. After this video, of course. Speaking of, there's spoilers for the last chapter and ending of Library of Ruina, but you already knew that, didn't you?
With that out of the way, let's hop straight in.
Distorted Philip takes revenge for being too easy the first million times you fight him by being one of the hardest ensemble fights, in my opinion at least. The main difficulty of this fight comes from the persistent burn that gets inflicted on your librarians, giving you a soft timer to complete the fight. Additionally, his overheated mechanic is interesting as it gives you sort of two playstyles. One where you avoid giving him burn to stop him from getting buffed at the cost of doing not a lot of damage. Or, you stack burn on him to avoid getting killed by the passive burn he inflicts and give him a bunch of dice power. Where this fight falters is in how one-dimensional it feels. He doesn't really have any mechanics that make you think, and if you end up dying, it often feels unfair because you got unlucky or had a bad composition. On the other end of that though, if you have good decks and a lot of sustain passives or debuff cleanses, then the fight feels really easy, which isn't really what you want in an endgame boss fight. I wish they gave him some more interesting mechanics or phases other than revisiting the crying children because it feels kind of empty as it stands.
Eileen and her ads. She's honestly one of the less demanding fights of the ensemble in my opinion. Clash with Eileen's offensive pages while killing off her worshippers. Try not to bring too much smoke infliction as those buff the worshippers' damage. As long as all 5 librarians have a decent amount of survivability, you should be fine outlasting Eileen and her worshippers. In addition, this fight is also soloable assuming you can get Grinder Mark 5-2. The only scary part of Eileen's kit is her Thought Gear Brainwash, which can immobilize your librarians on hit. However, it rolls relatively low for a mass summation, only reaching up to 20 on a max roll. Do keep her buffs in mind as well. They're the punishment for taking too long to kill off her worshippers, and they can be quite a pain to deal with if you don't kill them on the scene the buffs are played. The strength in particular is a little bit spooky. Otherwise though, the fight is pretty unguardable, especially with the abnormality pages that your sword has access to. But that's what makes it fun for me. How many chances do you get to pull out the old Dark Flame Grinder combo and actually use it for a few scenes? Not many. And this is pretty much the best fight for it. In addition, the fight does take a little bit of knowledge, so it's not completely unrewarding either. It's a pretty fun fight overall.
In my opinion, one of the better ensemble receptions. Her rolls are very high and her health pool is even bigger. This makes for some frantic gameplay as you watch your librarians get pummeled by the multiple 12+ rolls a scene. Her resilience passive is interesting. You're supposed to stack bleed on her to make her take more damage. This, along with the shark skin passive, injured resistances, and 1000 health pool makes her a very tanky shark. This fight is fairly reliant on you having good decks, as if you can't burst her down at the right time, your librarians will start getting one-shot through her other passive where she puts your librarian into the meat sack. Of course, if you mass attack to die and destroy it, then you can avoid this, Xiao being one of the best pages for it because of her cheap mass attack. Overall, Greta feels satisfying to fight because bleed stacking is inherently satisfying due to how big the numbers can get. However, the boss tends to falter if you have very optimized decks and get Sanguine Desire, as you can fairly easily stack 60+ bleed and just one-shot her with repeated bleed ticks without her putting up much of a fight. Still, a very good fight that feels fun to play against.
Bremen. Where do I start? The ads are annoying. Miss Mermaid and the Church of Gear worshipper in particular are kind of frustrating to deal with. Mermaid does a lot of stagger damage and also provides quite a few buffs for her allies. The worshipper, of course, inflicts smoke, so you take more damage. Personally, I always go for the worshipper first before whittling down Miss Mermaid. I just can't deal with the extra damage it outputs, especially with Vapor, though if possible just nuke both of them in the first scene. Miss Mermaid does have a weak stagger resistance to pierce, so that's something to keep in mind. The fight's, to be honest, surprisingly more gimmicky than people give it credit for. There's the mechanic of the whole Bremen hit thing where one of the three animals become active and inflict certain effects. The dog inflicts debuffs on your librarians with Feeble, Disarm, and Bind. The rooster buffs their allies with Strength and has a page that can be redirected by your librarians. And the donkey inflicts Paralysis and in my opinion has the coolest effect of all, Tagged. A librarian who is tagged can get a copy of a combat page that they wanna clash against. And it's such an interesting mechanic, but Bremen is kind of boring. All that stuff I just rattled on about doesn't matter as they're pretty easy to stagger each scene if you have decent pierce damage, making it kind of unnoticeable in the grand scheme of things. The second phase in particular draws a lot of ire, just invisible through it. Like, really? They couldn't have made it so Bremen could target untargetable units or something? I don't think it would be a stretch to say that Bremen kind of feels the most incomplete of the ensemble. It isn't that hard to overcome Bremen, and honestly the fight is more boring than anything. The mechanics are interesting, but they're never used in any meaningful way, which I find lamentable.
This clown guy is another sort of non-fight. He has two main mechanics that are both somewhat interesting, which keeps him from being even lower. The first is that most of his combat pages give the librarian clashing into it a bonus if they beat all the dice. I'm not sure if this is used anywhere else in the game, but either way it's very unique. His other and more impactful mechanic is that he can temporarily steal one of your librarians. This leads to an interesting minigame of sorts during deck building, since you might want to bring someone with weak or defensive focused pages to get taken so they become a non-threat during that phase, but aren't very useful otherwise. Or you could just ignore that mechanic and either clash or tank the pages that they use. Unfortunately for Oswald, the rest of the fight isn't really worth noting. There are other enemies, but they aren't very interesting, and he has a mass attack, but that's easy to outroll. A fairly easy fight with a very silly guy.
Tanya. She's definitely one of the more appreciated bosses in the game simply due to how fun her fight is. Tanya's entire shtick is that she doesn't have one. The fight's an honest scuffle between a distorted ex-syndicate member and a color fixer, assuming that you used Kali's page, and regardless, it's nothing a little mountain of corpses can't solve. Even without both those things, she's still a very doable fight. Personally, I've always liked both methods of dealing with Tanya. The lore-accurate method of relying on your 4 other librarians and the method of let me solo her. It plays a lot into the philosophy of Tanya's fight, and also introduces a lot of feel-good moments. For example, using Gebra to counter overspeed or protecting the other librarians by destroying Beatdown with Great Split Vertical. On the other hand, as proven by several skilled players, you could go in completely alone with Kali, and with some RNG, it's pretty winnable. Someone has even done it with P Gaming, which is pretty impressive. The fight just feels really fair, and it helps that it's really enjoyable. My only complaint is that the fight might be a little too easy, but in my opinion, that just shows the strength of the Red Mist rather than the weakness of Tanya.
Jae-Heon is a fairly generic fight. His unique puppet strings mechanic doesn't make for any exceptional gameplay, but it's still fairly fun. The race against the clock as you try to kill the puppets before they get the strings and become unkillable is good, and I like how the puppets use pages from Urban Nightmare. I find it especially funny that Creek and Repressed Flesh still feel somewhat threatening at this stage in the game. Generally though, you end up just nuking down Angelica and the weighty puppet in the first couple of scenes, then slowly kill Jae-Heon while clashing with the regular and nimble puppet, which isn't the most engaging. One last note is that if you do end up messing up and all the puppets get their strings, the fight becomes a lot more interesting as you need to manage your clashes with the puppets while whittling away at their strings by clashing with Jae-Hyun's counter dice. However, you'll probably never experience it, and if you do, most just restart because it's actually somewhat difficult.
To be frank, I find it quite amusing that the Step On Me characters get to face off against each other, Tanya with Gebra and Elena with Bina. This fight is pretty simple to be entirely honest. Stop Elena from applying her buffs, kill off the Vermilion Cross, and then finish her off. Circulation and Inject provide the Vermilion Cross with 3 strength, which is pretty ridiculous, and the remaining buff is also pretty good. Circulation gives him 3 protection, while Inject gives 3 endurance, which is very hard to deal with Obstruct. However, I do not think that this makes the fight particularly hard, especially when compared to others in the ensemble. Sure, Cross has some pretty high rolls with Shockwave and Rampage's Strike, but that's it. Rampage's Strike even has a built-in counter with Bina thanks to Degraded Pillar. Elena herself doesn't do that much. She heals a lot, and it's especially apparent in her mass attack, but that's it. It kind of makes the fight easier, to be honest, as it helps a lot of people realize, oh, I should kill Cross first. She capitalizes on mistakes, but doesn't challenge the player in any way else. This doesn't mean that she's a bad boss by any means. She's pretty average overall, but unfortunately, she just lacks the satisfaction of a fight like Tanya's.
Pluto tries really hard to be a unique and interesting boss. The Contracts gimmick forces you to build unique decks, and the Shades use those decks against you. However, the fight is just too confusing to be worth it. I did it the normal way on my first playthrough, and it wasn't very difficult, just annoying to restart 3 or 4 times because I misread a passive or a contract. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on who you ask, there's a cheat strategy for this fight affectionately called Blockma by the community, where you take Guard Stance Puppeteer with Myriad Block Dice and take the Lean Bloody Wings Abnormality page, since it goes through Pluto's damage and vulnerability, which lets you complete the fight pretty much solo in 3 or 4 scenes. For your other librarians, you just put on a bunch of combat prep and similar dice, and away you go. It's a bit silly and probably not intentional, especially considering the fact that Pluto doesn't even take damage from status ailments. But it's way more enjoyable than doing the fight legit, which is unfortunate because the cheese isn't very fun either.
I adore Argalia's fight. For me, everything about it is lovable. The dialogue between Roland and Argalia, the culmination of the ensemble's music and the fantasy of feeling like the boss. Starting with 4 speed dice, not having to worry about as much card draw and light restoration. It hits everything perfectly. Argalia's mechanics are honestly quite underwhelming and boring. Try to control your resonation so he can't trigger resonate. That's literally it. Slap on a lone fixer and a few other passives on Roland and you're prepared. Sure, the fight isn't exactly difficult or complicated, but that doesn't take away from the enjoyment or thrill of the reception. It's honestly really easy, but it has its place as a thematic conclusion of the Reverberation ensemble. It perfectly encapsulates what a fight between 2 strong and evenly matched fixers should be. The combat pages feel bespoke and perfect. Trails of Blue, Dissonance, Preludio, they're just very fun and well designed. And of course, you're finally able to beat that smoke face into the ground when you play Furioso against Final Impromptu. Can you tell that I'm smiling right now? I'm only talking about the boss fight as well, I'm not even playing it. That's just how much I like Argalia as a fight.
Roland's reception is the best reception in the game by a decent margin. Even setting aside the story, music, and visuals, which is also among the best in the game, there's just so much that Project Moon did right for this reception. The first phase is against a powered up Roland. It's a good starting place, the difficulty isn't too high, you're familiar with his cards, and it sets the stage for the rest of the fight. Unfortunately, the second phase is more of a story section to showcase the horror of the Smoke War, and as a result, the difficulty is fairly low. The spawning mechanic is interesting at least. The third phase is very nice. The Soulmates mechanic is unique, as are Ashen and Darkened Presence, but the real meat is the fourth phase. Again, music aside, this phase has so much going on, with so many phases and sub-phases. The memories and the weapon killing to debuff Furioso are clear standouts in my opinion, and while the difficulty isn't perfect, I'm sure some of you don't even know what I'm talking about when I say that killing the weapons debuffed Furioso. The sheer amount of mechanics, cards, and creativity make this the clear standard of the receptions.
This fight perfectly shows how different playstyles, decks, and flaws can change how one plays certain fights. I've always personally thought that you should kill Philip first. His damage is absurd, especially if you allow him to get overheated, and the burn he outputs is pretty ridiculous, especially with Scorching Desperation, which he plays every 3 scenes. Of course, there's also his passion passive, along with all the negative emotion he generates. He's just really annoying. However, Aleph felt that you should kill Bremen first due to the buffs they provide and the on-death effects they give you. We decided to set up a poll and there were actually answers for every member, which I was quite surprised by, though some people thought I was talking about the first Ensemble reception, which likely skewed the results a bit. Either way, the rest of the fight is slightly gimmicky, but overall just tough due to high rolls. Redirect Bremen's buffs, try to avoid having smoke inflicted on your librarians, and try to avoid letting Greta get her strength buff off. In particular, one should try to stagger Bremen pretty early on so that Martial Song of the Battlefield doesn't have that large of an effect. I know it's easy to say and hard to do, but this act is pretty much a reading comprehension test along with everything else in the endgame so far. The enemies roll pretty high, but they're still fairly beatable, especially as compared to what comes right before this. The on-death effects are also pretty interesting, but that's it. It's a tough first act, but definitely doable and not impossible. I would even argue that depending on your floor, you probably didn't even have to bother with any of their mechanics. It feels like they tried to fit all the bosses from Asia and their gimmicks in a single fight, which dumbed them down quite a lot. But with the time that Project Moon was given, I still think that the Starter Ensemble's Act 1 is honestly pretty okay.
The best of the three phases against the Blue Gang. This one pits you against Tanya, Jae-Heon, and Oswald, although it might be more accurate to say it's against Tanya and Jae-Heon since Oswald leaves after the first scene, leaving behind Mr. Knife and Miss Mermaid. Anyway, the red strings mechanic is pretty interesting and very funny for using Myeongest as it gives you a ton of haste. The gimmick with it is that you need to clash with Tanya's beatdown with the card that it gives you to remove the red strings while you kill everyone else. This reception's biggest flaw is that it's quite easy as the enemies don't have a ton of dice, despite Tanya's best effort, and quite a few of their dice are used up on defensive focused pages that you can just ignore, so you end up free hitting a lot for a ton of damage. Setting that aside, I like how the mechanics work together and make for a fairly cinematic fight.
I actually quite enjoy the Starter Ensemble's third act. The enemies here get pretty cool gimmicks and pages. Pluto's shade mechanic, for example, is pretty jank but really fun to deal with, especially if you're using something like Blockma or Gebra with Kali's page. I also like how you're given the choice of playing with his contracts as well. It's all very interesting. Elena, on the other hand, is pretty normal. She still heals an absolutely absurd amount, especially with both blood spreading and unending thirst. She does have a pretty cool mechanic in anti-recovery, which prevents your librarians from healing. I actually didn't know this also included stagger resist recovery, which is annoying but an understandable punishment. Last of all is the conductor himself, Argalia. He literally cannot be killed unless you've taken out both Pluto and Elena, which is frustrating, but whatever. His other passives though are actually fairly interesting. He has the resonance passive, which makes sense, but what I really want to talk about is intensifying emotions, which basically acts as a timer. There's two parts to it. The first one grants stacking strength and endurance to him and his fellow members every 4 scenes, basically forcing you to be aggressive. The second part of the passive actually helps you increase the emotion levels of your librarians for your abnormality pages and assists the 3 enemies with triggering their speed effects. It's an interesting mechanic and in my opinion a very well executed idea, though it might have been a bit overkill since the library gets 6 floors. Argalia's pages are nice to look at and helps him feel a bit more cohesive, stuff like Controlled Resonance, Cleave and Oscillating Sickle, which are all very interesting. And of course we can't forget Crescendo and Grand Finale, which are all very cool. Overall, a pretty okay and well executed fight. I feel like they incorporated the gimmicks from each person's reception quite well, other than maybe Elena's.
What can I say about the quote-unquote reception of the head? A lot of people are going to disagree with me, but I think that the head is unfortunately nothing more than a glorified cutscene. You don't really win, and you just need to survive a few scenes before they finish what they came for and launch you out of the city. There aren't really any super unique mechanics, and the enemies don't really change throughout the reception like some of the other boss fights. However, if this reception was an actual fight, it would be a top tier one, probably around rank 3 to 5, because you get to use a bunch of powerful pages that you normally can't use together, which is very fun. You could argue that getting Arbitrating the Arbiter achievement or killing Xena or Baral would count as winning, but the end result is always the same whether you do either of those or just barely scrape by. I wish that this reception could have been expanded on more, but it's understandable why PM couldn't, and so since this isn't really a fight, I have a hard time rating it as one.
And that about wraps up our boss rankings. Well, I said our, but he put the head in last place, so I don't really know if I want to stick my name on that.
Please feel free to let us know your thoughts and where you disagree with our list in the comments. Do keep in mind though that these are just our opinions and not the final say.
Right. Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to Aleph and make sure to visit again, yeah? See you around.